hunting died out, and they were unable to catch smaller things like deer and gazelle, and of course that eventually drove them to starvation. Of course, this is their range in North America, but around here in South America is where they were found. Now, I'm going to finish off with South America with the two giant animals that were probably the strangest on Earth, and they are these Toxodon and Macrauchenia. Now, I'm going to start with the Toxodon. Now, the Toxodon is probably one of the strangest creatures ever discovered. Of course, when Charles Darwin discovered their fossils, when he went to South America in the 1800s on the voyage of the Beagle, of course, Charles Darwin was the greatest naturalist and biologist who's ever lived. Of course, he actually wrote about the Toxodon in his journal, which soon became the Voyage of the Beagle. Of course, what he said about them, of course, he didn't actually see them alive like this. He of course found a fossilised skull, and he said, the Toxodon, probably the strangest animal ever discovered. Judging by the shape and position of its eyes, ears and nostrils, it must have been aquatic, like the dugong and manatees. But recent research has suggested that the Toxodon was probably more semi-aquatic, a lot like hippos. It's built a little bit like a hippo. I mean, it was probably about the same size and weight as a hippo, and they probably would have spent a large part of their lives in water. But down here is another strange creature. This was the Macrauchenia. I mean, it's a lot like a cross between a horse and a tapir, because they have those ridiculously long noses, a lot like a tapir's. And of course, these were endemic to South America, which means they were found there and nowhere else on Earth. And they were unrelated to any modern mammal. And of course, they quite possibly did live in herds, and until about 2 million years ago, they were preyed on by terror birds, but when the Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, and the dire wolves came down to South America from North America, both Toxodon and the Macrauchenia were preyed on by those animals. Now, as I mentioned, these animals died out around 10 to 12,000 years ago because of climate changes, and that meant that the larger predators, like the saber-tooths that specialised in hunting them, were also doomed. And here is their range. Now, next place I'm going to show you is Madagascar. Now, Madagascar today, I mean, it's a vast island in the Indian Ocean off the east coast of Africa, and Madagascar has always been the world's centre for weird wildlife, but there were animals there that are now extinct, but a lot of them were found with some of the strangest on Earth, and I'm going to start with the one that has fascinated me more than any other extinct animal over the last decade and a half. It is Aephiornis maximus, also known as the elephant bird. Now, the elephant bird was the largest bird that has ever lived on Earth. And when I say the largest, I mean it stood well over 3 meters tall, it weighed over 1/4 of a ton, and it laid the biggest eggs that have ever been discovered, even bigger than the biggest dinosaur eggs. In fact, as a scale of size, that is a hummingbird egg, and of course they are the smallest bird in the world, so they lay the smallest egg. That is a modern ostrich egg, and ostriches are found on Earth today. They're found in Africa, and they lay the biggest eggs. But this was the elephant bird egg, and I mean, I've got an eggshell fragment from an elephant bird egg, and of course these are enormous, and they are said to be rock hard. I mean, you could stand on one of those and it probably wouldn't break. Of course, the elephant bird was a herbivore, which is an animal that feeds on fruit and plants, so it was a vegetarian. But, I mean, no one's entirely sure how this animal went extinct. But, in 2011, David Attenborough, this man right here, David Attenborough, he made a documentary about the elephant bird, because this is also David Attenborough in the 1950s, because he went to Madagascar in the 1950s or 60s to film Zoo Quest, where he actually put together an elephant bird egg from fragments, and he still has that egg today. It's one of probably his most prized possession. But he actually said in the documentary he made that no one's entirely sure how the elephant bird went extinct. I mean, it could have been climate change, where much of its swampy forest habitat receded into desert. I mean, it could have been habitat loss, because when human settlers arrived on the island, they probably cut down a lot of their forests, so where the Aethionis browsed. I mean, I'm not sure if they would have hunted an elephant bird, because as we all know today, a fully grown ostrich has a kick that's powerful enough to open a man's stomach. So I'm pretty sure a kick from a fully grown elephant bird would have killed a human being outright. But they might have hunted a juvenile elephant bird, or a very old and sick elephant bird. Or it could have been the poaching of its eggs, which might have been seen as a great source of nourishment. So humans might have plundered the eggs of the nests of the elephant birds to get at their eggs. Or it could have been that when humans brought chickens to the island, they brought along with them avian diseases that the elephant bird had no immunity to. I mean, or it could have been a combination of all those factors that finally drove this animal to extinction. I mean, the truth is, we may never know how the elephant bird died out. But of course, by the 17th century, the elephant bird completely disappeared from Madagascar. There is the range that the elephant bird is found on Madagascar. Now, for one of the largest primates that has ever lived, the giant lemur, also known as Megalodopus, I think that's what it's called. And this was a lemur, like the lemurs that are alive today, but with one major difference: it could grow as big as a fully grown mountain gorilla. Of course, this animal might have been a herbivore, like lemurs of the modern day, but it had very, very big canine teeth, which were probably used for fighting and for defence. And it almost certainly was wiped out when humans arrived on the island of Madagascar and might have hunted them for food, as well as destroyed the habitats they lived in to make way for fields, as for agriculture. But of course, as a little bit of a size comparison, and that is the giant lemur skull, and that is a modern lemur skull. So as you can see, the size difference. I mean, I'm not entirely sure how this animal died out, but it is almost certainly a victim of human beings. That is their range. Now, another animal from Madagascar that only went extinct fairly recently, it was the Madagascan giant tortoise. Now, this was one of the biggest reptiles on the planet, of course, but unfortunately, until about the 1940s or 30s, this animal was driven to extinction in Madagascar because it was more than likely you're hunted for its eggs, its shell and its meat, which might have been seen as a delicacy, but also the habitat it lived in was destroyed to make way for agriculture. But of course, from all my research, there's only a few surviving members of this ancient group. I mean, a lot of them are not purely descended, but of course some of them are a lot of them are kept in captive zoos, and there are talks about bringing them back to South America, not South America, to Madagascar, which I think is a good idea because they can help reshape and preserve the forests that they lived in. That was their range. Now, the next country I'm going to show you where there are animals that went extinct is New Zealand. Now, New Zealand is famous mostly for the Middle-earth movies, but to me it's also famous for its bird life, because there's probably more bird species there than anywhere else I know of. Some of those were giants. I'm going to start with the tallest, the moas. Now, the moas came in fair few species, and of course they were giant flightless birds, but they were not as big as the elephant bird. In fact, they may have been as tall as an elephant bird, but they were never as heavy as an elephant bird. And of course, moas were actually first discovered in 1839 by this man, Professor Richard Owen, and he was the curator of the Natural History Museum in London, and he had a particular flair for interpreting fossils, and in 1839 a large thigh bone was sent to the island sent to the museum from New Zealand, and Professor Richard Owen studied its internal structure and said it must have come from a bird. Of course, the Maori people of New Zealand had legends of giant birds that once roamed their islands, but Europeans dismissed them as myths. But Professor Richard Owen managed to gather enough bones to put it all together, and he proved that this was no myth. Of course, the Maoris in their legends had called this creature a moa, and Professor Richard Owen proved that it once had existed, and you can still see the skeleton of this bird in the Natural History Museum in London today. And Richard Owen can be forgiven for this, but of course it's slightly inaccurate with how it holds up its head, because you can tell a lot about how an animal holds its head by looking at the junction where the skull and its neck connect. Of course, if it was underneath the skull, like ours, it would have held its head upright, but that moa's neck joint was at the back of the skull, so it probably held its head more horizontally, a lot like this. And of course, the moa was a herbivore, so it fed on plant matter. And this right there was the giant moa, which was most likely the biggest moa. And of course, also, unfortunately, the Maoris of New Zealand, when they arrived in New Zealand, they more than likely destroyed the moa's habitat, but also they would have more than likely hunted the moas for food and out of fear. And of course, while the Maoris can shoulder a lot of the blame for the moa's extinction, and I have recently seen that Peter Jackson, one of the most famous directors in the world, has been in talks with a scientific group who are talking about bringing the moas back from extinction, but I think that might not be a very good idea. I mean, I'm not entirely sure, but I mean, that's a debate for another day. This was their range. Now, you might think that such a giant bird would have no enemies in the isolated forests of New Zealand, but you'd be wrong, because there was another